The CEO looked at me and said, "You're done." The words landed cold like a stamp on paper. 15 years of early mornings, late nights, and tiny wins all folded into that one sentence. I stood in his shiny office while he handed me a thin envelope and did not meet my eyes. My hands felt heavy. I had built teams, fixed crises, and held promises together with stubborn patience. He slid the envelope across the desk like it was a paper plate. He called it restructuring. Behind him, glass walls showed a city that did not care. People passed below like ants. I remember the exact sound of his pen clicking, a small, calm noise that made my chest ache. I opened the envelope and found a payoff and a form to sign. It smelled like printer toner and finality. I tried to speak, but my voice turned thin. Before I could collect myself, a junior in the hallway whispered, "They just announced the deal, he moved $2 billion. The room tilted. My badge no longer fit the door scanner. The man who fired me turned back to his screen like he had closed a window. I walked out with the envelope and a resolve that burned steady. Outside the building, the light felt too bright. I clutched the envelope and the city seemed to stretch wrong. I called my sister but the line went to voicemail. I replayed every meeting where I'd warned people about risky accounts and been brushed off. 15 years of loyalty and now a signature erased it. My palms sweated as I remembered numbers I had saved and models I had tweaked. Some deals were still warm in my head. I sat on a bench and opened the envelope again. The payoff amount was not enough to replace what I had given. I thought of everyone who trusted me and of unfinished plans. A push of anger rose, hot and sharp. I wanted to march back in and show them the work they had thrown away, but my badge barked like a gate and refused me. A man in a suit walked by and did not notice my shaking. I walked home slowly, counting steps, assembling a list in my head of people who knew the number patterns, the ways money moved. The word done echoed and made me small, but under it curiosity and fury began to braid into something like purpose. At home, I sat at the small kitchen table and wrote a list. Every late-night email, every flagged account, every time I had asked for an audit. I pulled up my old files on my personal drive and found a copy of a report titled Executive Reserve Analysis. My hands shook as I opened it. The report showed odd transfers months ago, small shifts that meant nothing alone but together pointed toward a pattern. My stomach dropped like a trapdoor. I had been fired the same week those transfers turned into a wave. Someone had moved money at night and used my removal to explain questions away. The thought stung. I dialed an old colleague who owed me a small favor. He answered groggy and asked if I was okay. I lied and said yes. I asked about access logs. He hesitated and then texted a screenshot, an approval token timestamped at a time I had been home asleep. My name did not appear, but someone had used my protocols to authorize changes. Betrayal felt like a stone in my chest. I stared at the screen until the night light outside my window blinked and went out. Morning brought sharp focus. I dressed in a plain jacket and walked to the building with a fake visitor pass I borrowed. Security glanced and waved me through. Inside smelled like coffee and careful practice. I walked to the server room like I had done hundreds of times. The racks hummed in a steady, low song. My fingers traced labels until I found the logs folder. Someone had tried to cleanse it, but traces remained like footprints in mud. I copied files onto a tiny drive I kept for emergencies. The logs showed an external IP, then an internal approval, then an override. The override came from a top-level user controlled by the CEO. I felt my face go numb. I had evidence, thin but sharp. I left before anyone checked badges. On the street, my hands bled from a paper cut I had not noticed. The city moved on. I sat on a curb and breathed, feeling both small and fierce. The world had said I was done. I did not accept that as the final note. I reached out to a reporter anonymously. He met me at a diner and his pen scratched fast across paper. I slid the drive under a coffee cup. He ran his thumb along the edge like he was testing for truth. He asked who I was, and I said only what I needed. He promised to look without using my name. I felt greed and fear mix as I walked away. The next day, the newspaper printed a soft story about an internal irregularity and blamed hackers. The company issued a calm statement and promised an audit. My phone buzzed with friends asking if I was okay. I kept quiet. The reporter called later with a lead. A shell company reported a sudden large deposit right after the transfers. He asked if I could point to people who benefited. I thought of the CEO's flat anniversary photos and the board's overseas dinners. I thought of a network of comfort built on small erasures. Pride and anger nudged me forward. The world called it an incident. For me, it was a breach of trust carved into the bones of my life. I wanted more than headlines. I wanted justice. A week later, an envelope slid under my door. Inside, a single printed photo of me at my desk with a cake smear on my cheek from a staff birthday. On the back was one word: stop. My blood ran cold. Someone had access to personal images and my address. I took the photo to an old friend who worked in the archives and asked if it had been printed by the company. She said no, physical prints were rare. Someone had reached into a private place. I told the reporter what happened. He grew quiet and warned that we were bumping into dangerous territory. My kitchen light hummed all night as I lay awake thinking of who wanted me quiet. Mira, a lawyer I had consulted once, agreed to meet. She sat across from me in a parking garage, hands folded, and said bluntly that this could get dangerous. "You have to be careful," she said. Her voice did not shake. I felt a strange comfort in her steady face. The stakes had grown. What began as anger now had the sharp edge of risk. Mira filed for emergency motions and subpoenas. We asked for access to the company's archival logs and for freezes on suspicious accounts. For a moment, I believed the law could hold things steady. Then we found out someone had backdated approvals in a separate administrative system. The judge granted an injunction, and yet a clerk called to say transfers had been processed before the freeze. Someone had hidden the timestamps. We were running against a machine made to bend reality. Mara's face hardened. "They covered the tracks cleverly," she said. I felt both proud of our push and small in its wake. The board announced an internal committee and called for patience. The world liked patience when it favored the powerful. I could feel the CEO watching the narrative with a practiced calm. My first clear lead traced through a promoted executive who had benefited in quiet ways. The map of guilt was not neat. It wove through family trusts, property purchases, and consultants who came and went. I realized the only way forward was to press harder and to gather proof until the paper trail could no longer be smoothed. I started mapping connections in a notebook. Names, dates, tiny notes like wine gala or trust setup. Patterns began to form. A board member who loved art had suddenly bought a gallery. An investment firm with a friendly manager received a gift. The web grew and my anger sharpened into a focused hunger for truth. The reporters' pieces began to rattle the company, and insiders started to whisper. One IT head who once trusted me left suddenly and moved abroad. His goodbye email sounded ordinary but included a strange sign-off line that matched my old shorthand. Mira pressed for access to his archives and found remnants of a program labeled Cleaner, a script to erase logs. The evidence looked like scaffolding for fraud. I felt both shock and grim satisfaction. The world had presented a polished CEO and a smooth skyline, but beneath it someone had built a system to divert and conceal. My own removal, I realized, had opened a space for them to act without a watchful eye. The thought stung, but it also fueled a grimmer resolve. We found partial files, corrupted but telling. A consultant's name surfaced in drafts. He had set up shell routes and helped install scripts that masked transfers. The reporter traced payments to a trust in a distant country. He was excited and scared. The company hit back with lawyers, calling the reporting reckless. Mira told me to keep my head down and to let evidence do the talking. Still, the more we uncovered, the more blatant the cover-up became. I watched the CEO give speeches about transparency and culture while a hidden ledger moved like a ghost. The press split. Some believed the CEO, others smelled the rot. I began to get anonymous texts warning me to stop. "Leave it," one read. Fear sharpened like glass, but I did not step back. 15 years of being told my value had hardened into stubbornness. If the world would not protect the truth, I would hold it myself. The drive in my pocket felt heavier each day, full of fragments of a stolen narrative. A whistleblower emerged with audio files that named roles and scripts used to erase logs. The tapes were raw and shaky, voices masked but urgent. The journalist brought them to me in a paper bag, hands trembling. He said the tape included a voice like the CEO's. Hearing it made my chest hurt. The company called the audio fake. Legal threats blasted across inboxes like artillery. The public watched the drama like a show. Investors got nervous and the stock wobbled. I felt my life become a background for others' opinions. Yet each new hint about the CEO's private instructions made my resolve sharper. Mira planned a careful legal release of the evidence to regulators and a trusted outlet. The day the dossier came out, protests grew and the CEO's calm public face began to crack. In private, he grew colder. The battle shifted into courtrooms and shareholder meetings. People who had stayed quiet started to call me at odd hours, apologizing, confessing small details. Their guilt filled me with a fierce compassion and a renewed push to stitch together all the loose ends. An unexpected twist. The CEO invited me to a public town hall meeting and spoke about loyalty. He sounded sincere and talked about values while I sat in the crowd like a small stone in a river. After the talk he shook hands and said nothing important. Seeing him in a crowd made me feel both small and plainly angry. The town hall felt staged. Later, a leaked memo showed that senior staff had planned a PR push to calm investors. Someone on the inside had tried to make him look large and kind. The memo included notes about controlling narrative and quiet departures. It read like a script for moving blame. The journalist published it and the crowd hissed. I realized the CEO knew how to shape light and hide shadow. The next day, a key IT manager resigned suddenly and moved his family fast. His email archive had a folder labeled contingency, which matched something we had seen in the corrupted files. The game was getting uglier. People were being pushed out or coached to leave. The fight felt less like exposing mistakes and more like pulling back a curtain on a carefully choreographed play. I met the IT manager in a small coffee shop where his hands shook and his voice trembled. He handed me a flash drive and said, "I don't want to be complicit." He confessed he had helped with scripts but had not known the full purpose. He said he had been threatened. His testimony gave us a clearer map of the technical steps used to hide transactions. It felt like finding a missing page in a book. Mira prepared to bring the evidence to court. The company filed a countersuit claiming defamation. My phone filled with hate messages and supportive notes from strangers who believed the story. The CEO launched a charm offensive, donating to charities and giving interviews about moving forward. His public face and private moves were miles apart. I found myself exhausted by the theater. Still, the IT manager's files let regulators subpoena offshore accounts. For the first time, money flowed into sight that had been invisible. The taste of progress was bitter and sweet. I felt a new kind of exhaustion, one born of fighting a long war and still standing. The whistleblower we depended on vanished for 3 days. Rumors said he fled. My stomach knotted. The reporter stayed awake, calling numbers and checking hotel logs. Then, a burned hard drive was found in a trash heap behind a small diner. It contained fragments of emails and a note with the CEO's private nickname. The whistleblower resurfaced days later at a bus stop, pale and frightened. He said he'd been told to leave and not come back. His story added human terror to the technical files and the ledger fragments. We felt the stakes like a tightening band. Witnesses began to speak up because they could not live with guilt. A former board member reached out and said they had ignored red flags. Their voices were small but true. The trial of truth was messy and loud. The CEO began to look less untouchable. His private moves now had public consequences. The world shifted slowly, one person confessing at a time, and I felt that pressure toward honesty could actually change things. Public outrage swelled. Demonstrations grew outside headquarters. Investors demanded emergency meetings and the board announced reviews. The CEO tried to settle quietly by offering payments with gag orders, but Mira refused. "Money without admission is not justice," she said. The crowd chanted and voices rose. A small charity linked to the CEO's name came under scrutiny. We traced a strand of cash to that charity and found it had been a conduit. The charity's director was stunned and then cooperative. That helped us trace another thread. Every time the lid lifted a little, something else slipped out. Private memos, the name of a consultant overseas, a ledger entry that read like proof. I felt both exhaustion and small triumph. The CEO's calm cracked more and more, his interviews looked rehearsed. He took longer to walk out of buildings and stared at screens we could not see. The tide had turned enough to let truth find a foothold. The missing witness reappeared with a story of threats and a new piece of evidence. A bank transfer slip hidden in a cook's recipe box. It looked ridiculous but real. The slip listed intermediary accounts tied to a trust with the CEO's initials disguised. The investigator who found it said sometimes people hide things in weird places thinking no one would look. The slip led us to a small bank in another country. International law moved slowly, but it moved. The CEO's team tried to claim the slip was forged. Experts testified to its authenticity. We dug deeper. Another shell company showed purchases of property and art. The purchases matched dates right after the transfers. The evidence connected greed to lifestyle. I watched the CEO's public defenses deflate like a balloon. Behind everything, though, a chunk of cash still hid in a maze. Mira told me we needed a ledger, a single file that would show names, dates, and beneficiaries, to finish the case. Finding it became our obsession. We chased rumors of a ledger called the Book, whispered by insiders as if it were a myth. Mira and international counsel subpoenaed records from a trust company on the coast. Days stretched thin with calls and translations. Just when we feared another dead end, a clerk in that office found a misfiled packet stamped with an old date. Inside was a scanned ledger copied clumsily onto paper. The ledger listed transfers and beneficiaries with codes matching the CEO's nickname. The paper felt heavy in my hands. Proof had texture. The ledger linked moves in the company to purchases and trustees who were close to the CEO. The prosecutor breathed. Arrests followed. The CEO faced charges and the world watched his fall. I felt a strange numb joy. Years of being done had led to this raw moment. The ledger was not glamorous, it was dull numbers and names. But it exposed the truth and showed how people had been used. For me, it was the final map of betrayal. The trial felt like a public surgery. Victims told stories about lost savings and cancelled plans. A teacher cried when she spoke about retirement funds gone. A small business owner told a room how a withheld line of credit closed his store. The CEO sat pale, his face thinner than in boardroom photos. Evidence stacked, ledger pages, whistleblower tapes, the consultant's confession. I testified about the culture that ignored warnings and asked for audits. Speaking was ugly and freeing. The defense tried to twist technicalities and call my testimony emotion, but jurors watched faces and listened to timelines. The CEO's team painted a picture of complexity and plausible deniability, but the ledger kept returning to the same names. The public watched and reacted. The jury took time but returned with guilty verdicts on several counts. Relief hit me like cold rain, sharp and cleansing. The CEO had been the man who told me you're done. Now the court said otherwise. Still, the money was only partly recovered and the damage could not be fully undone. Sentencing brought finality and new questions. The CEO received years in prison and heavy fines. Several executives faced charges too. The court ordered restitution funded from frozen assets and seized property. Some funds came back and were directed to a restitution fund for victims. It was enough to help many people but not all. I watched each hearing and felt a steady ache mixed with small relief. The company restructured and promised reforms. Public policy changed a little. New rules aimed to prevent similar transfers without checks. I began advising a non-profit on safeguards. The fight left scars, but it also made me a different person. People who had ignored warning signs called and admitted their part. I accepted apologies that felt small and honest. The ledger had been the hinge that swung the case. It was a plain book of numbers that became a mirror revealing who they were. I felt grief for the years lost and gratitude for the truth that finally arrived. A surprising twist came from the entrepreneur who had run the phony startup that laundered funds. He showed up at a small hearing and confessed he had been dazzled. He said he had been promised growth and connections and had helped funnel money without understanding the source. His remorse was raw. He led investigators to more accounts and small leads that helped recover additional funds. The court considered his cooperation when deciding his sentence. His story underlined that greed seduced people at many levels. Not all were villains in black hats. Many were small players who chose wrong or were forced by threats. The entrepreneur's cooperation showed a sliver of redemption. For me, it meant more money returned and a strange sense that justice could be messy and partial and still worth the fight. I thought often about the moment the CEO said, "You're done," and how that line had begun a chain of events that changed lives and laws. After the trials, my life shifted from reactive fury to steady work. I helped create safeguards, taught staff to spot red flags, and spoke at conferences about cultural change. People sent messages thanking me for not staying silent. I still kept the envelope the CEO had handed me. It sat in a drawer like a relic. I learned to rest in small ways and to trust fewer people but truer ones. The world had not become perfect. Some money remained hidden and some lives were irreparably changed. Yet institutions changed slowly. Regulations tightened and companies set up independent watchdogs. I felt proud in a quiet way. I met survivors at small dinners and shared simple, honest stories. We were not heroes. We were witnesses who insisted on truth. Forgiveness came slowly for me. I forgave not to free the CEO but to free myself from being chained to that sharp moment. I kept a list of names who had helped and a list of those who had not. One evening, years later, I walked by the old headquarters. Construction crews were painting the lobby with new logos and kinder language. A plaque about transparency hung by the entrance. I paused and touched the cool metal. The memory of the CEO's office flashed, his pen, the thin envelope, the click of the door. A man walked out who reminded me of the old CEO and I felt a small flinch. Then I smiled and continued. I had changed. The fight had not just been about money but about the shape of honesty in business. I spoke at a small memorial for whistleblowers and read names out loud. People clapped softly. The ledger no longer lived in secret. Parts of it were in court exhibits and public archives. It had turned a private theft into public lessons. I thought of all the people who had helped, Mira the lawyer, the reporter, the whistleblower who suffered to speak. I left the plaque and walked into the evening with a sense that I had been part of something bigger than myself. New twists continued in quiet ways. Small prosecutions followed against mid-level people who had helped hide transfers. Some escaped punishment, others paid. The entrepreneur served a short sentence and then worked with investigators. He later met with community groups to warn others about the easy lure of fast cash. He said he wished he had said no. Hearing that made me think forgiveness and justice could coexist imperfectly. I published a short piece about corporate culture and small controls that matter. It was read by many who said they used the ideas to prevent abuse. People wrote to me about the reforms they implemented. Each message felt like a small stitch repairing an old wound. I still kept the photo someone had mailed to scare me. It sits now in a folder labeled Reminders. I do not forget how close anger and fear felt then. But now anger has a job, to remind me to guard truth and protect others from being told they are done. Life moved into softer rhythms. I started a consultancy that helped non-profits and small companies set up transparent systems. It was slow work and good work. I met bright people who wanted systems that did not bend for one strong person. I traveled a little and saw small offices where honest checks mattered. Each time I taught a workshop, I felt the ledger's echo. People asked about the big trial and I told them simply that truth takes time but it matters. A few former colleagues came to training and apologized openly. Those moments felt like small suns. I still had nights when the memory of the CEO's smile made my chest ache. But the heaviness lessened. I began to mentor younger women in finance, showing them how to read numbers not just for profit but for fairness. They asked sharp questions and I felt glad. The story we had made together, painful and raw, had become a lesson for others. The final twist came unexpectedly. A small film group asked to make a short documentary about the case. They wanted to tell the human side, people who lost and who fought back. I agreed. The filming was quiet and honest. We met victims who held paperwork like proof of stolen dreams. The documentary did not glorify me. It showed many faces. At a screening, people cried and then clapped. A young woman stood up and said my story inspired her to speak up where she worked. That made my chest bloom with hope. The film helped many people learn how to spot silent shifts in accounts and culture. It reached schools and training programs. Seeing the story told so plainly felt like closing a loop. The ledger had started a long process that turned private hurt into public learning. I knew the world still had crooked corners, but I also knew people could choose differently. Years after the CEO told me I was done, I stood in a small room where a plaque honored people who exposed the truth. I touched the plaque and felt the coolness sink in. The money lost had not all returned, but lives had been rebuilt and systems changed. I had learned that being done could begin something. I had been scared and lonely, but I had also found allies who would risk themselves for honesty. The CEO sat across a glass in a courtroom once, a small man behind thicker bars. I forgave him not because he deserved it but because I wanted to move forward. I kept the envelope and the ledger copies as reminders of what had happened and why the fight mattered. My name is Mira, and my life changed the hard way. I showed them what done really meant, that endings can become beginnings, and that truth, slow and stubborn, can turn wrong into reform. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and tap the bell to get notified the moment we drop a new story, and don't forget to like the video to help others find it.